Liberty. I think most people, certainly in the West and many other parts of the world, cherish liberty. They see it as a great value, equating it with freedom. And all of us, of course, want to be fairly free. And ever since the French Revolution, at least, where it was one of the three great things to be aspired for, equality, fraternity, and liberty, we've wanted liberty. But many people don't really think, and I'm sure I didn't, and through much of my life, think about what you actually mean by liberty. Because it's all very well to desire it, but why isn't it universal, and what are the constraints on absolute liberty, libertarianism of various kinds? Many discussions more recently have started with considering an article by Isaiah Berlin on two concepts of liberty, in which he makes an important distinction between positive liberty, where you encourage people and say that they have rights and that they should enforce them, and that the state tries to positively interfere in liberty, or other groups positively encourage liberty. And so that's the liberty to do things. It's the active side. So I have the liberty to go walking or singing or have my thoughts as I want and so on. And those are human rights and liberties. Then on the other side there are what he calls negative liberties. That is the freedom from, rather than to, freedom from fear, from oppression, from hunger. And those often are a much smaller number of freedoms, but they are jealously guarded. And what he argues, and I tend to agree, is that these two traditions are to be found in two different forms of government. In authoritarian systems, then the state tries to force its citizens to be free, and it proclaims all sorts of laws which try to regulate life so that there is a freedom for its citizens. And those authoritarian governments are often the ones we disapprove of. He says the British tradition is much more to do with negative liberty. A famous example is Thomas Hobbes, who said that we, as individuals, in the end, we have one negative right, which is the right to existence and to live our lives, and against Leviathan and the state, we can fight to preserve that life. To take an example of the difference, if you were designing a game of football in terms of positive liberty, then you would try and make many, many regulations which prescribed how you could freely kick the ball towards the other person's goal. You could freely run towards the ball to kick the ball to, and so on. Dozens of minor regulations which give you liberty by prescribing all sorts of things you can do and maybe you ought to do. If you were designing it from the point of view of negative liberty, you would just make 4 or 5 rules: that players, except the goalkeeper, can't pick up the ball, that the ball once out of the pitch, off the pitch, is no longer in action, that you can't be offside, in other words, in front of the other players' teams, and that's about it. Strangely, for games, most games do just have quite a few simple negative rules, and they work very well because they then leave everything else up to creative invention and the playing. So it's much more playful, whereas the positive regulation of minor aspects of life, which is found in certain branches, for example, of Roman legal systems, where the Romans tried to prescribe exactly what rights you had and what duties you had and so on in great detail. That system, which you also find in the constitutions of certain governments, written constitutions which try to lay out paragraph by paragraph and sub-paragraph and so on, very long and detailed regulations. And the proponents of negative liberty say, well, this is hopeless. Life is messy. Life is constantly changing. There are many things on the borderlines rather than fitting clearly in. And in order to keep such a system up to date and working, you constantly have to add further and further bureaucratic and legal prescriptions. So it doesn't work very well, and it leads to over-regulation of life. So I personally have rejoiced in the fact that I live in a country with few laws and an unwritten constitution. And I also realized one further fact, which is that as well as rights and liberties, there are rights to do with your duties. There's a danger of constantly stressing your rights against other people or to do things. But a number of traditions, for example, in China and elsewhere, say that every right and liberty you have should be balanced with an equal duty towards people, and those are just as important as your freedoms. And so your duty towards your family or your parents or to the emperor or whatever are just as important as your rights as individuals. So our system is very much stressed on the individual and their rights, and sometimes the duties between ourselves are less prevalent, and we have to be aware of that all the time.